I'd just like to let you know that I will be recording the session. The English department doesn't organize many of these guest speaker events. And when we did so, we found that there was another event going on at exactly the same time on exactly the same day about translation. So I've been asked if I can record the event so that we can put it on the department website. And I hope you're all okay with that. For those of you who may not be part of my class, welcome. I'm Rebecca, an assistant professor at the
allow me
department
to share screen.
Yeah. You need to share screen as well?
Can you see my screen?
I'm sorry, we are doing the literature talk. Okay, it may be because of the event that's going on at the same time. So those of you who don't know me, I'm Rebecca. I'm assistant professor at the Department of English Language and Literature at Xi'an. And this is part of our contemporary literature course, contemporary fiction in this semester. And we're doing a 2-week block on adolescence and sexualities. And I'm really, really pleased to welcome our guest speaker today, Marika from the Africa Center, a good friend of mine. And also happy to welcome Gilbert, who is a Xi'an student majoring in sociology, who's interning at the Africa Center, I believe, and I'll let them introduce themselves. They're going to basically do a reading / presentation / discussion of the book Under the Udala Trees. And so yeah, we'll get on, shall we?
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for having us. And I'm super excited for this session. And I think Under the Udala Trees is a book I really enjoyed reading. So I read it quite some time ago, but I had to reread it now, of course, for the session. I have it here. I have my copy here. So I'm really excited for this. But before we jump into that discussion of talking about Under the Udala Trees, we would also like to introduce the Africa Center a bit. Rebecca says we're from the Africa Center and Gilbert is currently doing an internship there. And we thought it would be nice if he would introduce the Africa Center to you as a fellow student. So Gilbert, over to you.
Hello. Hi everyone, I am Gilbert. I'm currently a year 4 student at Xi'an University studying sociology. I'm working at Africa Center as an intern for about 2 months now, since January. And I have been enjoying the work at the Africa Center. So today I'll be sharing about some of the activities that we do at the Africa Center. Hold on, I'm just going to share my screen. Can you guys see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so okay. Yeah, so about the Africa Center, it is a platform that fosters value creating interactions between African and non-African communities in Asia. It has been open since 2019. So there are 3 missions that the Africa Center upholds. The first is rebranding Blackness, connecting communities, as well as Black consciousness. So there are various programs that is held by Africa Center, and if you're interested, I think you can also participate in some of them. So the first one, the food, I think everyone will enjoy it. You know, there are cooking workshops and some lunch sessions that we welcome people to come in and try out the African food. I've tasted some of those before, and I really enjoy it. So next, there are, in terms of education corner, there are African Literature Book Club that I've also been to before. There are also some cultural sharing programs, as well as diversity and inclusion workshops. And for the art corner, you can also attend the Afro dance workshops, or maybe the drum workshops if you want to play some drums. And in terms of entertainment corner, you can also go to the center for the film screening, and also the multicultural hike. And for the cross corner, there are Chongqing Mansions Tour, World Board Games Night, African Kids Club, and the Youth Club. So the Africa Center released a monthly magazine that is focused on a particular theme. And there are some really nice articles inside. And if you're interested, you can also purchase one of these magazines. So if you go to the Africa Center, there are also souvenirs that you might like, as well as some snacks and drinks. So the Africa Center has several media coverages from such as SCMP, RTHK, and Hong Kong Free Press. We have also received some positive feedback from people who have attended, either attended one of the events, workshops, or have been to the center before. And if you want to know more, you can check out the Africa Center's website, or use one of the QR codes to their social media accounts. And yeah, feel free to check out the site. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert. That was great. And just on a personal note, I've been mostly involved with the Africa Center Book Club, but I know they have a lot of other activities. And so it's a very welcoming community, and anyone is welcome to go at any time, from any background, with any knowledge of Africa or none at all. They're a really great group of people. So thank you, Gilbert.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, for those kind words also. So thanks Gilbert for the introduction. So that's a bit more about the Africa Center. And I think if you want to know more, you can also find out on our website. But now moving on, we want to engage into the topic that we want to discuss today, and which is this book, Under the Udala Trees by Chinelo Okparanta. And I think it would be important that before we start discussing the book, before we really get into the themes that are in the book, for example, that we kind of set the scene and we set the context that we find this book in, so this book is not existing in isolation, for example, and it has a scene that it's set in, right? And for me to do that, I'll also just share my screen with you. Just a second. I hope you can all see my screen. Great. So starting off, today, what we're touching on is a story that is kind of within the context of queer African literature, right? And that's something that is a genre that more and more, we're seeing more and more works of people who are writing in this kind of group and who are talking about queerness on the African continent in an open manner. So not to say that this did not exist before, but I think also we need to think about how it's being written into the literature, for example, and how that's changing over the years. So I would say that maybe in the past decade, we've seen really a big push where we've seen a lot of authors who are writing about different experiences, even of sexuality, for example. So we have here Chinelo Okparanta, but we also have people like Akwayeke Mezi. We also have people like Tendai Huchu, who are different authors across the African continent who are trying also to bring this aspect into the field of literature. So I was wondering, and I really think that you can use the chat function here to just type and say what it is that you think about when you hear about LGBTQAI+ in Africa. Any of those letters or the plus. Have you heard anything about it in Africa? Do you know anything about it? And if so, it would be really great if you could share it in the chat. And then we can also reflect on that later at the end of the session. So I'll give you the chance to share on it, but I'm not going to look into those answers right now. So just feel free to respond whilst I continue the conversation, basically. So I think that a lot of times when people think about this topic on the African continent, unfortunately, it's been very strongly met with an idea of hostility, especially towards anybody who seems to express any forms of these expressions, so gender expressions or even sexualities, for example. There is a very common notion of Africa as a whole, as a continent, being very hostile to queerness, right? And I think it's really important to be able to understand these things and to also be setting them into the context of Africa. So when we think about Africa, there are 55 countries on the African continent, according to the African Union. And in those 55 countries also, we have different religions that are practiced, for example, and we also have different ethnic groups that find themselves there with different histories. And so it's really difficult to say of the African continent and speaking of it as this homogeneous place, for example, because there's a lot of diversity even within the African continent. So thinking about specifically on what kind of rights you have or what is illegal or what you can be punished for, right? So there's only a few places that allow same-sex marriage, the most prominent being South Africa, which allowed same-sex marriage since 2013, whereas other places homosexuality is not legal, but there's no recognition of it in the law. So for example, if you were in one of these countries like Madagascar here, or Angola, or DRC, or Mozambique, it is not illegal for you to be homosexual, but there's nothing in the law that would protect you, for example, right? If somebody were to maybe practice hate against like a person for being homosexual, there's nothing in the law that protects them. There's a lot of places where it is punishable by prison. So you see a lot of these countries up here in the north where it's punishable by prison, and also here. And I think it's important to note that in a lot of these places where it is punishable by prison, also there's diversity in that. So in some places, this is something that is enforced, right? And in some places, it is not enforced, right? So I'll give you an example of where I come from. So I come from Zimbabwe, which is this little country here, which is the orange painted country down here. And basically in Zimbabwe, the law states that it is illegal to be homosexual, but only if you are a man, because specifically in the law, they talk about penetration. And so what is illegal in essence is gay sex in that way. But in essence, for example, if you're a lesbian, you cannot be taken to court because they wouldn't consider that as a statute in the court. And I mean, I guess that's really interesting of seeing about what are the details and how does that play out. There's places where it's punishable by prison and unenforced death penalties. So you have here northern parts of Nigeria. So you see even that there's diversity within a country. So in the southern part of Nigeria, it's punishable by prison, but no, not by death. And in the northern parts by death. And then there's only one place where it's enforced death penalty, which is here on the Horn of Africa, which is Somalia. So I think that what I'm trying to show by this is just that there's a lot of diversity on the African continent towards these things and even towards the laws. And that's something that I want you to keep in mind whilst we continue this conversation, to not think of it as a homogeneous group. So today we'll be talking about Chinelo Okparanta, who writes about this region, who writes about a country, Nigeria, right? So Nigeria over here. And also she speaks about specifically the Biafran War that we will look into in more detail, which also causes and shows some division amongst the people there. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to say, if anybody has any questions at any point, feel free to just drop them in the chat, or if you're feeling courageous, you can also just unmute yourself and ask the questions. I'm very happy to engage in more of a discussion also with you on this, so it doesn't need to be me just talking to you. Right. So I think also what's really interesting to note is that a lot of people argue that homophobia is an idea that was introduced by missionaries and colonial administrators. And this is, you might think this is quite a sweeping statement and you want to know, like, really understand what this means, you know, and also if we think about it now, I think a lot of people think about colonialists, for example, if you think about England or if you think about Germany and places like that, where for them now, you know, there are laws that protect people of varying sexualities, for example. And so where does this really idea come from? So once again, I'll speak on this in more of a general context. So in a lot of African countries, homosexuality, obviously, and different forms of sexuality would have existed before. This is not something that is new in any sense. But what was new, what came with missionaries and colonial administrators, was the colonial law, right? And the colonial law was the first time in many African countries, as we know them now, that these sorts of sexualities were something that were talked about in the law, right? As something that people actively talk about and actively say, this is something that's illegal or something that's not legal. So this is not to say that everything was all happy and, I don't know, jovial in those times. I think that in the same way that you have with all societies, you would have had problems in all societies, for example. But it is to say that people were maybe not as much linking the idea of sexuality or the way that people express themselves in those realms as something that should be controlled by the law, right? And this is something that very much came through missionaries and colonial administrators who also linked sexuality specifically to morality. So if you are a person who has sex with less people, then you're seen as somehow more moral, or you're seen also, if you were to use, for example, a lot of Christian ideology, you would have ideas of like purity, ideas of even virginity for women especially, and that's something that specifically came with the introduction of Christianity and also with the introduction of a colonial law, right? Great, I hope that everybody's understanding this as we go on. And so I want to show you some examples actually. So I think a lot of times when people think about African queerness, they don't really have anything to concretely think about. So in South Africa, as I said, same-sex marriage is illegal, and this has been the case since 2013. And here you see two men who are getting married, actually, and seemingly in a community that's accepting that. And very interesting that these men have chosen to dress in this manner also, which is a very traditional sense of dressing. And I think I really like this picture because I think it very much brings together this idea of an idea of acceptance even within the traditional cultures. But those are not the only examples. So I think when we think about, when we think about marriage, for example, now in this way that it's done, even here you see, for example, the exchanging of a ring is very much also influenced by a lot of Western cultures. And I think we think about the terms of queerness in also a very Eurocentric manner, in that that is often thought as the way to be able to express queerness. So for example, now we have very famously things like the Pride Parade, which is thought of as, you know, this paramount expression of what it means to be queer. And that's not to say that it is not, but I'm also wanting to highlight that it is also not the only way for these ways to be expressing. And so I want to show you a few examples that are a bit interesting and a bit different to what we have now, like what mainstream media has taken up as part of this queer movement. So there are places, especially in southern parts of Africa, where you have the tradition of pulling of the labia, right? Which would happen basically when women are supposed to get ready for them to be having, getting married, and for them also to be having sex. And we can talk about this tradition however we want to talk about this tradition, but what is really interesting is that in a lot of groups, it was commonly accepted that, you know, in a certain sense, women might be having sexual interactions with each other through this ceremony, right? And here we have a quote, for example, by a traditional healer from Mozambique, who says, with the passage of time, they get excited and end up seducing each other and having sexual relations. This phenomenon is known as oseselana. They do this clandestinely without their parents knowing. Right? And so as much as it was something that happened without their parents knowing, yes, but it was still something that seemed to be socially accepted, that women would kind of have these sexual interactions with each other, with a group of women, before they enter into the field of being married. But of course, when you got married, then you would be getting married to a man. As a woman, you'd then be getting married to a man. And that's, for example, one example. Now, today, it's not known commonly as a sexual practice, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that in a way it had been. Another example was the Omapange in Namibia. So when men enter into such a relationship, they possess their wives collectively, but if women are each other's Omapanga, it means they have sexual relations with each other, something the elders were fully aware of. So this is another example of something that's different. This was in Namibia, where basically you would be able to take somebody as your Omapanga, and it would be common knowledge. So if you were a man, it plays out differently. It means that you have your wives together, in essence. But if you're a woman, it's different in that it means that you have sexual relationships with whoever this woman is. It is important to note that in present-day Namibia, however, this word Omapanga is actually understood as a form of friendship that does not carry any sexual connotations anymore. And a lot of people have talked about this, about it also being an erasure in sorts during the colonial era, who was documenting these things, and through missionaries who were very much interested in kind of putting on a forced morality onto the people. Once again, this idea of morality being linked to sexuality. So these are just a few examples. Another example that I really find quite interesting, and I think that this links so well to the book, is of women marriages. Women marriages have been recorded in some 40 societies across the African continent. And so this is really something that was happening on like quite a large scale if we think about it. And I think that when we think about this, it's important to note that in many African societies, there can be a stance where women can take on the position of a man, right? So for example, once again, I'll give you an example of myself. As I said, I'm from Zimbabwe, and if I am in my father's house, right, because in that side, I am the descendant of the man, I get a higher social status, you know, because I am in my father's house. But whereas if I was in my father's house, because I'm the descendant of the woman, I would have a lower social status. That's a really small example, but it shows you also how the positions move and how it's influenced not only by your own genders, but by the genders of the people around you, and also in what context you are finding yourself in that situation. And so there have been different societies that have recorded marriages of women. And I'll show you a few examples. So Juliana and Esther Soy in Kenya, they were married in the early 1990s. And as far as I know, they're still alive and they're still married. And basically what would happen here is that women who could not have children and widows took wives and claimed the children of those wives as their own. Right? So basically what would happen, let's say if I am a woman or I'm widowed and I did not have any children, I could take on a wife. I could say, I need a wife, I'll take on a wife. And usually in a lot of cases, that wife would be younger than me. And that wife would then be allowed to have children it depends on the society, but you could have children with depending on different people. And those children, I would then claim them as being my children, right? And I think that what's really interesting about this form is that it gives quite a lot of liberty to the woman, especially the younger woman, as to who she can go around and be sleeping with, for example, right? And in this situation, also, a lot of people argue that, yeah, okay, well, maybe it's not so much about a sexual relationship between the women, and that's fine. It might not be about a sexual relationship between the women, but I think it's important to note that there were different ways of managing these things, and also different forms of marriages that were allowed in different African societies, and to a certain extent, even up until now, are still allowed. But we can also talk about the effect of different religions also, and also again the effect of colonialism, and as we move on, also the effect of globalization, about what we think is socially acceptable now. In Igbo lands, women were considered exceptional in the eyes of society due to their wealth or social standing. And those who were past menopause could marry wives for themselves, for their husbands, for their sons, and or for their siblings. However, marriages between two men were not permitted, right? So this is a very interesting case, actually, because here, more than just playing the role of you're marrying for a man or you're marrying for your son, for example, a woman could, if she had enough wealth, actually take on a wife for herself, right? So she could say, I want to be married to this woman, I will take on this wife for myself. But of course, also it came with, it was only if you had achieved a certain level of social status, if you had a certain level of wealth, and also age, right? So I think you would know that in a lot of African societies, there's a lot of reverence towards elders. And so this again comes up and plays in that. And it's interesting that you see in a lot of these societies where women marriages were allowed, you had different rules when it came to what it meant for a man to be allowed to marry another man. Right. So talking about marriages of women, I really wanted to show you this clip. And this is a series, a Nigerian series. So I think many of you would know of Nollywood, which actually produces really a massive amount of movies and really quite some primetime entertainment. And this actress here in front, I know her from even when I was growing up, and she's quite popular. And in this series, basically, she plays a widow who has lost her husband. And what she does is she goes and she marries a woman for herself. And I think it's also really important to note that this is a series that came out in 2020, right? So this is something that is quite new. So I will play just a scene for you where this woman, the main character, is talking to her brother-in-law, so the brother of her deceased husband.
I've made my point.
You have no points.
That Aruka, what kind of abominable deed of yours am I hearing in the market?
What did you hear?
That you went to marry Akuna's daughter. What kind of tradition is that? Huh?
Wait a minute. Are you not an elder in this community?
Of course I am an elder in this community.
And an elder in this community does not know that a woman who does not have a child for the husband can marry another wife for the husband, so that the person can bear an heir that will keep his posterity.
That kind of tradition has never worked in our country.
Says who?
It will never work.
Who told you that?
I'm telling you that. I'm telling you
You're
that.
lying.
I'm telling you that.
You cannot stop
That girl will not enter into this family.
You are lying. Look at you. Why don't you, you cannot stop me. I have already married this girl, and she will come and give me an heir that will inherit my husband's property. Not people like you. Wicked people.
Stop pointing your finger on my face.
You cannot do anything. I will point it. I will point it.
No. I've made my point clear. That girl will not enter into this family.
Shame on you.
I'm telling you.
It's a lie.
I'm telling you.
You have failed. You see, you have failed. Already she's married. She will soon come into this compound. And then she will live and bear children for me. You can't stop me. Wicked man. It's because of you people like you, that they gave women authority to go and marry for their husbands.
How about you, Agoma? How about you, Agoma?
Right. So I just wanted to show that clip because it's really interesting how she's interacting with this guy. And also, so this is her brother-in-law, and she talks about how basically she will go and marry a girl, and that girl will bear children for her, and those children will inherit the husband's property, right? So it's really interesting here when you consider it, because I think a lot of traditions might place a lot of importance on, for example, bloodlines, and so you being able to carry your bloodline. But in this case, those children who would be these children of the new married wife would not in essence have actually any blood connections to this original husband, but in that way they could still be able to inherit his property, and they would still be considered as his children, because in the situation the wife basically becomes the husband. She becomes her dead husband, and in such a way she can act in this manner. And I think it's really interesting also when you see the interaction between these two, because she's clearly not afraid to say whatever she wants to say to him. And this again is also about the authority that she feels she has as the husband, as the wife of the older brother. Right, so this man is the younger brother, so she feels she has a lot of authority as the wife of the older brother. And so this plays out actually, so this episode is from Nigeria, Nollywood, as I said. And also, I think it's interesting that the book that we're reading is also based in Nigeria, right? And of course, it's not going to be one-to-one in every situation, even if you're looking within a specific ethnic group. So even if we're looking, for example, amongst the Igbo people, which Ijeoma in the book is, you will also have a lot of diversity and a lot of variations even within that group. But I think it's really interesting to be able to see and express those things in that manner. And so today, we're going to be talking about Chinelo Okparanta's Under the Udala Trees. And before I really get into that, I think what's really interesting, and also what we can think about in comparison to this presentation that I have just given you, is that Chinelo Okparanta does something that is quite different, right? In the sense that she doesn't draw back to what you might say traditional beliefs or traditional forms of life, but she very much sets herself in the world as she knows it today, or I guess as a lot of people would view Nigeria as being today, right? And she doesn't try to argue outside of Christianity. So this is something that some other authors do. People like Akwaeke Emezi, for example, who also is Nigerian, argues based within the traditions of Nigeria and saying, for example, that Christianity, foreign concepts to Nigeria, something that was brought in by colonizers, and so she doesn't even, so they won't even try to reconcile with that. Whereas Chinelo Okparanta very much bases a lot of her arguments within the Christian belief and does the argument from within the religion. And I think that this is something that's very interesting because I hadn't seen it done in this way before, right? So let's look a bit at Chinelo Okparanta herself, and also thinking about her book. So this book, Under the Udala Trees, is the first novel that she's published, but it's not her first work that she published. Before this, she had published a collection of short stories called Happiness Like Water. And interestingly, Happiness Like Water also has a lot of themes that are quite similar also to Under the Udala Tree. So you also have a very strong focus on the realities of women, a very strong focus on the realities of Nigerian women in Nigeria, but also Nigerian women abroad in the United States. And then also, you also have the theme of Christianity, and you also have a very strong theme of homosexuality coming up in her books. So Chinelo Okparanta is a novelist and a short story writer, as said. She was born in Port Harcourt in Nigeria, and her family immigrated to the United States when she was 10 years old. So she, I guess, lived a lot of her life in the United States, and that's where she still lives today. But she claims that a lot of her stories are very much influenced by also her understanding of Nigeria, and also from hearing stories from people like her mother and people like her aunts, who very much influence her story writing and things like that. So we're going to watch quite a short clip, or it's about 10 minutes long, where Chinelo Okparanta is talking a little bit about herself, but she's also talking a little bit about this specific book that we will be discussing today, Under the Udala Trees. So let's take the time to watch that. Oh, before we get there, sorry, I just forgot about this. I think I found some quotes on her specifically and about what she was saying. So she says, for example, I was writing because I had a desire to write stories. That was my way of processing things I saw around me. It is a little scary. When you're putting words on a page, you're afraid of being misunderstood. It's just scary to know that once you put it on paper, it's no longer yours, it belongs to other people. And I think that these may be fears also that a lot of people might face as writers, but I guess in any form of artwork that you produce, it's kind of produced and then it becomes out there. And maybe that's something, I just thought it was a nice quote to put in there. Maybe it's something that also people in this room can relate to. Maybe we also have some writers here in the room, so maybe that's something you can relate to. So let's watch this clip where Chinelo Okparanta is speaking a little bit about herself in the book.
Happiness was what she called it, but I knew that happiness was a word like madness, like sickness, like confusion, like loss, like death, even like beautiful or pure or angelic or God. Happiness was a word that represented some deeper, inexplicable, heavy idea, the kind of idea that goes back and forth between two different worlds.
That was Chinelo Okparanta reading to us from her stunning debut novel, Under the Udala Trees. Welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
This book has been a long journey for you. It's brought you here to Paris,
Yes.
because it's been translated into French. It's about a young gay woman's coming of age in Nigeria during the Nigerian Civil War. Tell us about where this journey started. What was the inspiration for it?
Well, initially, I wanted to write a story about a family, and I wanted to write this story to show what journeys the characters in the family, or the family members have gone through. But as I wrote the first few drafts of the novel, I realized that the one story that stuck out to me was the story of Ijoma. That was the important, essentially the heart of the novel. And so I followed that character, and this is the novel that came about. But I'll say that my mother's story also inspired me, because my mother lived during the Nigeria-Biafra Civil War, and she also lost her father during the war.
Now, while the war rages around her, Ijeoma has to grapple with the dangers of her emerging sexuality and her love for Amina, who's another character in the book. Now, when the relationship is discovered, her mother gives her Bible lessons as a way to prove to her that her act of love was an abomination. Now, the book suggests that a narrow reading of the Bible is partly to blame for Nigeria's treatment of gay communities. Can you talk more about that for us?
You know, I grew up a Jehovah's Witness, and so I grew up really studying the Bible. And as a child, I had so many questions about why we interpret the Bible and the stories in the Bible the way we do. As an adult, I studied with Marilyn Robinson, a Bible scholar, when I was at the University of Iowa, and I asked her those same questions. And you know, I think it's important, which is something I learned from Marilyn Robinson. I think it's important to keep in mind the context of the Bible. So it's not only the interpretations and misinterpretations of the Bible, but also that certain laws and certain rules in the Bible existed for practical reasons during certain time periods. And it's also important to see if those rules still apply today, and to research to see what the practical reasons were in order to understand why we have those rules in the Bible. You know, it's an interesting thing, the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Even between those two books, laws change, rules change. So why do we no longer change certain rules?
And you've discovered through your research that in the past, some cultures in Nigeria weren't against women to women marriages. Your grandmother was married to another woman. Why did homosexuality become a sin?
Well, I mean, you know, based on my research, it seems to be that, you know, the Western missionaries brought this idea of homosexuality as a sin. Now, yes, it is true that my grandmother was married to another woman, but, you know, people will argue that point. They'll say, well, it was just an economic alliance. It was you know, a system that gave into patriarchy. There were reasons why a woman in Igbo land would marry another woman. It was maybe sometimes to continue the family lineage if that woman was unable to have a baby. But the bottom line is that there was a system in which that existed, that in which a woman-to-woman marriage was permitted, and traditionally it was not looked down upon. And so, you know, when we think about it and we say, oh, well, that was different. It's not so much different from marriages in the Western world. Those were also financial alliances.
Contract.
Exactly. And so if you ask me, well, was there love in between, you know, was there love between those two women? You know, maybe not. You know, was there love between the alliances that were made in marriage in the Western world? Maybe not. But the point is that that system allowed it, and it was not a crime, and it was not looked down upon at that time. So why should it be now?
The end of the book is quite hopeful, but you turn the page, and in the author's note, it says that in 2014, Nigeria's president, Goodluck Jonathan, signed a bill commonly known as the Jail the Gays Bill, criminalizing same-sex relationships. You can go to prison for up to 14 years. And in the northern states, the punishment is death by stoning. How do you see LGBTQ rights gaining traction in Nigeria?
You know, I think literature is very important in a country like Nigeria. This is a country where, you know, the younger generation sees politics as a way, or used to see politics as a way of changing the world. But at this point, you know, being in the government seems sort of futile. It's not really making the changes that we'd like to see. And so, you know, I noticed that many young people now turn to the arts. And I think that's a very smart way to go about it, because if you cannot change a system top down, sometimes it's a good thing to think about other ways, which is to say you can change a system bottom up. And so by changing the way people think, you know, which is what literature does, it changes your thinking. It helps you, you know, sort of examine what, you know, teachings, principles that you've grown up with, and to see if you really believe in it. So, you know, many young people are now turning toward literature. And I think literature is very important in the fight with, you know, for LGBTQ rights. You know, young people are now opening their minds through books. People write about it. If you you know, look at many of the writers today, there are quite a number of people who are on the continent writing about LGBTQ rights.
It's not just writers as well. One of the films that got everyone talking at the Cannes Film Festival this year was the lesbian love story Rafiki from the Kenyan director Winuri Kayu. The director told me, though, that for her it was first and foremost a love story.
Yes.
I really wanted to tell a love story first and foremost. There are not enough love stories coming out of Africa. So it was really important for us to be able to tell a really tender, soft, innocent, kind of naive love story about these girls. And despite all the difficulties they go through in the film, I feel like there's such love and such tenderness between the two main characters. Then that's what we wanted to glorify. That's what we wanted to put forth. That's what we really wanted to celebrate, the idea of young love.
Winuri's film was actually banned, though, in Kenya for promoting homosexuality. Your book tackles gay rights, being gay in Nigeria, but also war and faith, massive subjects. I mean, how has it been received by your family, by your community in Nigeria?
I have a very loving family, and so, you know, it's been a journey in my family. I've been able to speak with my mother openly about, you know, the subjects about which I write, and I feel that I've seen her, you know, become more and more open-minded. But in terms of being in Nigeria, I also feel that, you know, I'm seeing a journey with my audience in Nigeria. When I first wrote my first book, Happiness Like Water, there were many Nigerians who were saying things like, your parents must be disappointed in you, embarrassed in you. What are you doing? This is not our culture. You've been, brainwashed by the West. And, now after having written Under the Udala Trees, I get messages from Nigerians saying, thank you so much for writing this story. This is my story. And it's really wonderful to feel seen, to feel that somebody understands what I'm going through. And so, I know that this book is important and that this book is reaching those people that it needs to reach. That being said, the reception has not always been positive because, a couple of years ago, I think I was in Lagos and I was to do a radio interview, and the radio host said she can't talk about the novel because if she talked about it, she would be fined. And so, there's still a lot of resistance, and people are afraid for their lives in a sense, and so there's still some work to be done.
And it's not just in Africa, it's not just in Nigeria. This week, the French artist Kidi Smile released.
Right, so that was kind of a bit of an introduction into Chinelo Oparanta and Chinelo Oparanta's work. Let me just stop sharing the screen here. Right, and I think it's a very good introduction actually starting into the book, and I really wanted you to see actually also on Rafiki, which is the Kenyan movie that they speak about, because for me those two characters in Rafiki actually reminds me a lot of Ijeoma and Didi, who is her second lover, because for example they also go to parties together, and for example you also have the idea of raids happening at these parties, and this is something that you also see in the movie Rafiki, so it might also be of interest for you to watch that movie. And so I just wanted also to read out this author's note, which is at the end of the book. I'm not sure if all of you have had the chance to look into the book and read out the book, but I think this is a really important setting of the context of the book, as it's also written in the book. So it says, author's note: on January 7, 2014, Nigeria's president, Goodluck Jonathan, signed into law a bill criminalizing same-sex relationships and the support of such relationships, making these offenses punishable by up to 14 years in prison. In the northern states, the punishment is death by stoning. This novel attempts to give Nigeria's marginalized LGBTQ citizens a more powerful voice and a place in our nation's history. Yes, so I think you will realize that there's even here a difference. So we looked at it before about the north and the southern parts of Nigeria, and you hear it again here in the criminalization of this. And I think that's really important because when you think about Amina, who was Ijeoma's first lover, she comes from the north, so she's Hausa and comes from the north, whereas Ijeoma herself is from the south and she is Igbo, right? And also what's interesting is that these people also practice different religions. So the Hausas are Muslims and the Christians are, and the Southerners are Christians. This is not to say at all that for some reason Muslims will be more homophobic or less, but in this situation, that's how it plays out, basically. So, and that's just maybe a division that's important to note. And this was a law that was passed in 2014. And if you all remember, this book itself was published in 2015. So this would have been something that was really at the forefront of Oparanta's mind when she was writing this book. And also, I guess it's very powerful of her to be writing this book at this given time when people are actively doing things to marginalize the LGBTQ community even more than it already is. Right? So those are just some interesting starting points to look at and to think about. Another point that I want you to think about before we go into a short break is just the idea of the title itself. So Under the Udala Trees. So I don't know if any of you had the chance or the interest to kind of also look a little bit more into why this tree specifically and why is it coming up. And actually it comes up in the book itself, right? So the title is somehow quite significant to a lot of the things that happens in the life of the protagonist Ijeoma. So firstly, the Udala tree in Igbo like mythology is something that presents female fertility, right? So girls will be told to go and sit under this Udala tree for them to be blessed in a sense with a lot of fertility so that they can have a lot of children, right? And I think that this is very interesting that she then uses this symbol of female fertility and uses it in this argument of homosexual relationships, right? And the tree comes up again, I think twice more in the book. One time is the first time that she meets Amina, who is her first lover in essence. And then also later when Amina announces that she's actually going to get married to a man, they are once again standing under an Udala tree. So this Udala tree comes up a lot of times within the courses of the book, and it seems to almost mark different stages in the life of this main character, Ijeoma, as she goes through different stages of her life. It seems that the Udala tree marks it. So I really thought that was a really lovely name, and I like the play on also using this idea of fertility and playing with that also in the sense of telling a homosexual love story. Right. Does anybody have any questions so far? I know I've said a lot of things, so I'll give you just about a minute to think if you have any questions, and you can either just say them out loud or you can type them in the chat box.
I have a really quick question. I'm sorry. I don't want to dominate if people have questions, but my question was when you showed us the map and the legal situation, right? Is there any connection between the colonial power and the legal situation now? Like what I mean is, for example, East Africa was primarily colonized by the British, and I'm wondering if do their laws still follow that basis, and like say the French in West Africa, is there a correlation?
Let me pull up the map for you actually. Where are we here? Okay, so I just want to show it to you when I'm responding to that. Okay, so I guess you can see the map right now, right?
Yeah.
So yes and no, right?
Yeah.
So you see that a lot of countries that were specifically colonized by the British tend to be quite homophobic.
Yeah, so exactly.
All of these countries here coming down in the center, also Mozambique, South Africa also. And then, but what you do see definitely is very much here in the north, where you see quite a strong that it's punishable but in prison, so it seems quite strong there in the north, and a lot of people say that that's also to do with the colonization of the Arabic colonization also coming in, so and also Islam coming in, and the Islam towards homosexuality and how that plays out in those specific situations. And so that's kind of what a lot of people would point to rather than that. But I do think it is also quite jarring to notice that especially a lot of countries that were colonized by the British up until now, with South Africa being the strong exception, would also still very much hold these very homophobic laws and very, very strict in those senses. So I think...
And interestingly that some of those French colonies actually say it's legal, but it's not recognized, which seems kind of a more relaxed approach, right? So I'm wondering if that has some connection with maybe the French law or something.
I think it's also worth considering about how the colonialism itself played out different
Yeah.
situations. So in a lot of places that were colonized by the British, it was quite present, like the presence of the British was quite present, right?
Yeah.
So not just that they would have ruling through chiefs, for example, who they would use as their puppets, but in the sense that you actually had these people who were present there. You had like commissioners, for example, living in these small villages, and they were really present and trying to enforce their ideas onto these people. Whereas a lot, like, for example, the French colonies and the Portuguese colonies, they kind of took more of an attitude of, as long as we're getting what we want out of this, we're not so much.
It was more of a hands-off thing. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that also quite reflects on how that plays out later, because as I said, most African societies in pre-colonial times, whether they accepted homosexuality or not, or whether they accepted different forms of sexuality or not, right, that we can discuss about, but most of them didn't write these things into their laws, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
and I guess that makes sense, because why why do you really care who somebody is sleeping with? But that's my personal opinion. But anyways.
Right, but also that it was codified under the colonial rules. Like, so it was codified along with a whole bunch of other rules. It's kind of interesting, right?
Yes, yes. And I think a very strong factor driving that was this issue of morality, and about how the body in its essence is immoral, right? So I think that's a very strong message that we get from the Bible, especially talking about how the flesh is weak, for example, and that's a very strong message we get from the Bible. Where we have another example, I think, Rebecca, you remember we read This Mournable Body also at the book club, and in that she has a scene where the women kind of strip, and it is a way of shaming men, for example. And so when old women strip, this was commonly done amongst especially Bantu groups of people. But during the colonial period, once again, this idea of the body being immoral, this was something that was very, very frowned down upon, and so much so to the extent that it doesn't happen in that way anymore. So I think these are very important links that we can explore also.
Yeah,
so,
definitely.
If nobody else has a question, we'll just have a short, about 5-minute break for you also just to be able to collect your thoughts. I know there's a lot of information that has come in, and we'll come back at 55, and we'll then really be delving into the book specifically, because now we've just been setting the context. And if you come up with any questions during the break, you can always just type your questions once again into the chat. Feel free. And then we will come back in 5 minutes. Right, great. Right. I hope you've all had some time to process. Sorry, I just sent something in the chat by mistake, so don't worry about that.
Thought you were sending alien messages, Marika.
It was just a mistake, don't worry. Let's then also delve really into the book that we are reading, that we read, and specifically just thinking about different themes that we had in this book. Just give me a second. I just want to open a document that I have here. Okay. Great. So before we jump right into it, I don't know how, as I said, I don't know if you've read the book or not, but I'll give you a brief summary of the book so that you know what it is that we're talking about, right? Then after that, we can go into more detail looking at specific themes that we have in the book, right? So this book is written in the first person narrative, and the name of the character who's speaking to us, her name is Ijeoma. So Ijeoma is Igbo, and she is born around in the 1960s, or maybe, 1960s, basically. That's where the book starts. And at the beginning of the book, she lives with her mother and her father, and they're very happy. It seems like a very sweet little family. Everything is great, right? And then what happens? In 1967, we have the start of the Biafran War. And this is a real war that happened. So this is not just something that she talks about in fiction. And I think you saw that Okparanta talks about her mother having lived through the Biafran War, which was a civil war that happened in Nigeria. I think we won't get too much into the details of the Biafran War, but if you're interested, you can look that up. And in the book, that starts in 1967, and that's when they start hearing about it. So they're in a city called Ojoto, and that's when they start hearing about the Biafran War. And basically, there's a lot of bomber planes that come and bomb their city overnight. So they create bunkers, right, as people tend to do in situations of war, for them to be able to hide out when an air raid is happening. And then one day it seems that the father is a bit in a strange mood, basically, and they have been warned that there is an air raid that's coming, and both Ijeoma and her mother run basically to the bunker, and they're not able to take the father with them because he seems to be in some sort of a trance and he won't move, right? So he just sits down on like the edge of the sofa and he's mumbling something to himself and he won't move. And as it happens, their house is bombed and the father dies in that bombing of the house. After the father dies, things quite shift a lot in this situation. And so Adaora, who is Ijeoma's mother, has the death of her husband has a very strong psychological toll on her. And she also seems to be in some sort of a trance, and she seems not to be able to do a lot of things for herself. And she has some really terrifying nightmares. She eventually decides that Ijeoma should go away. She should go and live in another city called Nwewi, where she lives with a grammar school teacher and his wife. And this grammar school teacher and his wife were friends of her father before he passed away. And so they do take her in. However, it's maybe not what she imagined, because she was thinking she was going to go to school there, and then that, she was going to be taken care of as maybe a daughter, basically. But it does seem a lot that she kind of takes on this role of like a domestic worker in that situation, and not so much the role, or well, more of an unpaid domestic worker, and not the role of a daughter in that sense, and she's not sent to school. But anyways, it doesn't seem like such a terrible life that she's living there. And eventually she meets somebody called Amina, and Amina is a Hausa girl. as I said already, and she just kind of followed her, and they had their first interaction whilst they're once again standing under an Udala tree. And then Amina doesn't seem to have any sort of family or anything, so she's then taken, Ijeoma then takes Amina with her to her house, and then they just start living together. And at first, the grammar school teacher is a bit like, oh, I don't want her here in the house and things like that. But eventually they realize, okay, maybe there's no issue, there's no reason for it to be a threat. And it is important to note that the reason that they are so scared is because there is conflict that's specifically happening between ethnic groups, and Amina belongs to that ethnic group where people are basically fighting each other, and the others, as in the grammar school teacher, his wife, and Ijeoma are Igbo, right? As it goes, Amina and Ijeoma seem to fall in love, and they already sleep in the same bed, which makes things quite easier for them when it comes to having sexual relations. But at this point, they're still quite young, so it's not something that they really explore so extensively. But when they found out, Ijeoma is sent back to her mother because, as they say in the book, that this is something that they don't find acceptable, basically, and they're really shocked. Also, all of the adults in the book are really shocked, and so Ijeoma is sent back to her mother. Her mother tries to basically pray the spirit of homosexuality apparently out of her daughter, and she has very intense Bible study lessons that she forces Ijeoma to do, and in a lot of the verses she kind of highlights what the Bible were to say about homosexuality. And I think if you did manage to read the book, you will notice that it's very interesting how these Bible verses are also presented, because Ijeoma gives her own interpretation of these Bible verses, and oftentimes it's not necessarily something to do with homophobia, but just like maybe it's just a lesson on hospitality, she says, for example. So it's really interesting how she engages also with the Bible throughout the book. After this, then she goes to a high school, and then surprise, surprise, who's there? Amina. And then they start having a relationship again, but this slowly fades out also because Amina, in a sense, is also fearing, and there are a lot of things that are happening in their society that influence that. At the end of their high school career, Amina is getting married to a Hausa man, and that is also something that is announced to Ijeoma, and in a sense she's quite heartbroken. Then that chapter kind of closes, that chapter of her life. Then we move on to her living with her mother in a small city called Aba, and there she meets another woman called Didi, and they also fall in love. And when the mother finds out about this relationship, the mother once again tries to pray for her, once again forces her to read a lot of Bible verses, and tries to get this spirit of what she calls a spirit of homosexuality out of her. Eventually, Ijeoma, I guess, is also tired of fighting these things, and so she consents, and she ends up concedes, and she ends up marrying a childhood friend of hers called Chibundu, and they have a daughter together, right? And they end up splitting up because her husband finds a lot of love letters that she has written during the course of their marriage to Ndidi, who is the girl that she was in love with in the city where her mother lived. And yes, and then at the end of the book, basically, Ijeoma takes her daughter, who she had with this man, and she goes back to her mother, and she says to her mother, basically, I'm tired, it's too much, I've had enough. And I think this is really interesting, and you see it on the last page, is that the mother also seems to, in a sense, kind of say concede and says, okay, fine, because she says, God who created you must have known what he did. Enough is enough, right? And I guess we'll look into that. We'll get into the discussion of that also when we're exploring a bit more the relationship that Ijeoma has with her mother, and also the mother-daughter relationships in the book in general. But it's really interesting that the book ends quite on a positive note, and that's also something that you saw being discussed in the interview round. Right, so that is kind of the summary of the book. I hope I've explained it well enough to you, and I hope you now have a general idea of what is going on in the book, right? And what we want to do now, right, is I want to give you short paragraphs, basically, that are coming from the book itself. And I want you to just also look at those paragraphs and think about different themes that I've written on the paragraphs, and think about how you view these things. I don't know, Rebecca, if it would be possible to send them into breakout rooms.
Yeah, we can send them into breakout rooms if you'd like. Yeah,
Okay.
I can do that.
Yes, so if we could send you into breakout rooms. So what I'm going to do.
How many rooms do you want?
Maybe 4 or 5.
4?
4 is fine. 4 is fine.
Yeah. So I'll let me see. I'll make 4 breakout rooms, and I'll let them choose. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Yeah.
So
Okay. So you guys can be choosing. Okay.
So let me explain the assignment before you go into the breakout rooms. So basically, as I said, you will get a bit of a text, a bit of a task for you to be doing in these breakout rooms. And basically, I just want you to read these paragraphs and think about what it is that you are understanding, what you think the author is trying to say in these things. And it would be really great if when we come back from the breakout rooms, you can also just explain a little bit of what it is that you have understood and what you have discussed. So I'm going to give you 4 little texts that are numbered. So depending on which breakout room you're in, I guess it would just be easier if you're in breakout room 1, just choose text 1. If you're in breakout room 2, choose text 2. If you're in breakout room 3, choose text 3, and so on and so forth. Here you go. You have 4 of those in the chat, basically. So you'll get about 15 minutes for you to discuss these topics. So just think about, I've written a little bit, so I've written belief systems, societal pressure, violence and the police, and then the role of Christianity. So think about the text that you are having in relation to whatever the theme is that I've picked up on that, and what you think the author is trying to communicate. That's all. So go ahead.
Okay, so just join yourself into any breakout room, and then use the one that Marika's assigned. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Read through the text, okay, and think about the heading that she's put at the top and how the theme is shown. Okay, they're joining the room. So can you see this as well? Can you see the rooms?
Breakout rooms.
No.
Yes, I can see the rooms. I can.
Okay, so they're just joining now.
Yeah.
So everybody's just joining in. Everybody's just joining. So basically then read through the text that's in the chat. So if you're in group 1, read text 1. If you're in group 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4. And then after you've read the text, think about what the author is trying to say, especially in relation to the theme that Marika's put at the top of the passage. Okay, so we've got people joining still. Okay, so we're getting there. They're joining.
Okay. I think I might bounce through the rooms.
Can you do that?
I hope so. I will. Maybe can you just keep your phone close by in case I can't. I will. I'll join. I'll just join the first one for now, and then from there I'll move on.
Okay. Or I can assign you actually. I don't know if you.
I can just join. I think. So
okay. All right.
For us, so I'll just join this one. Okay, great.
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
Hi, they're just doing an activity in some breakout rooms.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I tried the link, but it didn't work for me.
Yeah, we had a couple of problems at the beginning as well. We just tried it again and it was fine. I didn't put a password on it, but the students have just had an introduction to the book, and then they're now in the breakout rooms to do some textual analysis. They're just reading a short passage and then they're going to come back and discuss it.
How many people turned up?
Well, we've got about 20, just over 20, I think.
Oh.
So most of them from my class, and then we've got some other guests. So.
Okay, good. So actually, I'm very busy doing all sorts of things, so I probably won't bother joining it now since I've missed the beginning. So
Well,
I
we
hope
are
it goes well.
recording it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your support. We're recording it, and I'll ask our colleagues to put it up on the website maybe later.
Okay, I can check it out then.
And you can have a look. Yeah. Okay. Thanks,
Okay,
Peter.
talk to you later then.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so I was able to go there. I'm going to join another one, so I can move myself, so it's okay.
You can move yourself. Okay. And we just had my head of department, Peter Story, join us to check we were all doing okay. That's who I was talking to. But he says he's a little busy and he might watch the recording later on, but he just wanted to check in and see how it was going.
Great.
So you can join another room, can you?
Yes, I can. Cool. So I think there's one where Gilbert and Sarah are in, so I'll leave that one alone. But
yes.
Two.
Let me see. Yes, Gilbert and Sarah are in room 3, right?
Yeah.
And so which one were you just in now?
I was in room 1, so I'm going to go to room 2 now.
Okay.
All right.
Hi, guys. I just came to join your room to check you were doing okay. Is everybody all right?
Yes, we are looking the article and the novel.
Yes, and you have the number 4. So talking about the role of Christianity. So it's quite difficult to read that part from the Bible.
Yes.
Yes. so have a look through it, and then when everybody comes back, we can have a look. We can have a chat about it.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I just went in and checked on room 4, and they were going through the Bible quote, so they were doing okay.
Okay. All right, great. I mean, then in that case, we're good. Let me just check the schedule. So I don't know why it keeps disappearing from me.
What's disappearing?
My schedule of like what I want to do next and everything.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay, yeah, but I guess we're good. I'll give them maybe like another, because the other room still seemed quite a bit in discussion. So
right, good.
I'll give them another 5 minutes or until
Yeah.
25 past, and then we can start.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, it's a good idea. We'll do that.
Right. I'm just hoping that with everything, I'm not going through it too quickly.
No, I think it'll be okay. And don't worry about finishing up a little early, because I wanted to remind them about next week's reading as well. So
okay, all right.
I could.
Yeah. I think my plan is when we come back here is to just have a discussion in the bigger round with all of the themes, so that they can each discuss, and even if they hadn't had that. And then we have a bit of an open discussion on it. And I have a last point that I wanted to bring in, which is specifically about the relationship between the mother and her. I found this book so interesting. You know, I forgot about it, but then I was reading through it again, and I was like, wow, so many things.
Yeah, there's a couple of bits I wanted to mention as well. There's like one great quote I wanted to mention because it really stuck with me. Yeah, I think it was one about, I wrote it down somewhere because it was so good, but it was one about the gender of your first love determines the gender of all your future loves. I thought that was so clever.
Where I think I marked that too, but where was that?
I got it at 229. I don't know if we've got the same edition though. That was just my copy.
Let me see try my luck.
Mine was a hard copy from the library, so it could well be a different page. But yeah, I just like that idea, you know. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was the sham church. I loved that bit where they had like the pretend church and it was like basically like a club. It was so cool.
I thought that was really funny too. Yeah, I thought that was really funny because it's like we're better to hide than in the church itself.
In plain sight, right? And where are you going to be safe?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just with a bunch of girls in the church, right? What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. Yeah, I think also it's quite interesting because I wanted to highlight also there's I guess quite a lot of groups now, even in Nigeria, that are advocating a lot for like the rights of LGBTQ and kind of expressing and speaking out loud. So like I see like even on platforms like Instagram, for example, you have people who are active on that, and it's I think quite brave still, like considering that this is still illegal, you know. And also now you have a lot of movements of like trans women also in Nigeria, which is also I guess taking on a different aspect of it, but very interesting still. Yeah.
I also think it's interesting the way that I mean, I think you touched on this when you were talking at the beginning, but you said about how like in the West it's associated with things like pride and like being very flamboyantly open, and I'm not sure that that's the only way that expressing sexuality can happen. I mean, I understand why it's like that. It's because of the way things have developed in the West. But, you know, the idea that the only way to express it, because there are so many other models, especially in this novel, right? She shows us another way that you can kind of work the system. And it doesn't mean that you dress flamboyantly and go on a pride march.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
there are plenty of other options.
Yeah, yeah.
But it reminds me of some of the issues around feminism, right? People think there's only one way to do it. Like if you're a feminist, you have to behave in this particular way. And if you're a queer activist, you have to behave in this particular way.
Yes.
But there are plenty of
particular way.
yeah, there are plenty of other models to do it. And it might not be anything to do with fear or society. It might just be a personal choice that you are not a flamboyantly, you know, person who enjoys large processions, right? Like that might just be not your thing. Yeah.
For sure. I guess we can call them back.
Okay, let's call them all back. Okay, guys, so we're going to leave the breakout room and join back into the main session. I think you have a minute or so to come out of the breakout room. And do you want to go through one by one, Marika?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Will you be able to share the text on the screen with us?
I can definitely open up the document that I have and just maximize. Yeah, I can do that. Let me do that.
Yeah, it might be helpful to see it.
Right. You see that?
Yes, I can. Yeah, perfect. That's great. Yeah.
So I don't know how many we were, but I guess
21. 21, I think. I think everybody's pretty much back.
Okay.
Okay, so come back out to the main session. Yeah, I think everybody's pretty much out now.
Great. All right, so I hope you had some engaging and interesting conversations in your breakout rooms. And so we would really be interested in kind of finding out what everybody was saying in the breakout rooms, also so the other people can also know and find out. So I'll just go breakout room by breakout room, and I'll just ask one of the people who is in the breakout room to just come up and say something on what happened. So the first one that we had was this quote, which basically talks about dreams. And I guess what's really important is that Mama used to say that our dreams were the way in which we resolved our problems. Somebody who was in breakout room 1, can you give us a bit of your thoughts on what you had on this little paragraph here?
Yeah, sure. And just like I said, and I think the dreams here is implying to the situation and of the society that the author is facing here. And I think she keeps emphasizing that she was stuck in the dreams that she cannot get out of. And her mama used to taught her that the dreams is the way for her to resolve the problem. But it's irony that she end up stuck in one and cannot, and the dream becomes her problem or obstacle that she has to come through. And other than that, I want to mention that she's trying to seek help from her parents, and it's the instinct that we will try to seek help from our parents when we have a problem in our life. But the thing is, and for this, the problem that the author facing here, her parents cannot even help her, and I think she felt helpless in her situation here. And I think that's the whole point of this belief system related paragraph.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Neil. And I think it's really interesting how you talk about that she's kind of trying to find help in this sense, but she's not finding it. And I guess this is very much very telling of basically, in a way, the relationship she has with her mother throughout the text, where to a certain extent, you could maybe argue that the mother is interested, is kind of thinking she's doing what's best for her daughter, but in that way, she's not realizing that she's harming her daughter in a sense. And so, as you said, what is supposed to be the solution as in analyzing the dream is specifically what becomes the problem. And I think that's really powerful of you to think about also in that way, Neil. So thank you for that. I know that Neil and Keith were in the first room. Right, so let's move on to the second quote that we have, which is this one. And I put over the heading of societal pressures because I was trying to lead you in a certain direction. So those people who were in room 2, can you tell us a little bit about this quote?
Sure. So the quote is about how Amina, she probably hopes to get married to Ijeoma, and because they were quite young at the time, they probably didn't fully comprehend the societal pressures that would lead them to require them almost to have a heterosexual marriage to a man, for the sake of both acceptance in society and for financial security purposes. But it's also clear from this passage that they're kind of subtly rebelling against societal pressure in a sense, even though it doesn't really work out in the end, as we see later in the novel.
Yeah, definitely. So I like the idea of them rebelling against societal pressures in just even having the statement that they say, oh, well, it would be nice to be married to you, you know, even just entertaining that idea, I think is something that is really quite powerful if you are finding yourself in a very oppressive society when it comes to, for example, what it means to be able to engage in a homosexual marriage, right? And as you said, they are quite young when they have this discussion. So they have this discussion when they're still living together at the grammar teacher's house. So this is before the first time that they have been caught, so before they're even in high school. So I think at this time they are around 13 years of age when they are having this discussion. And I think it's very interesting when you think about this also, what it means to be married and what imaginations you have of marriage when you're quite young. You know, I myself, I'm not married yet, but I think I may have a bit of a better understanding of marriage than I did when I was around 13 years of age. And I think it's really interesting. We were recently read also another book. What was that? It's escaping my mind, sorry, the title of the book, but in the book you also have quite a young girl who is infatuated with her uncle and she wants to get married to her uncle, because in the same way, and I see that being reflected here, is that you don't really have that much of an understanding of what marriage really entails, and it's just this idea of, oh, you know, I like my uncle, so it would be nice to be living with him and he can buy me nice things, right? And in this way, maybe Amina and Ijeoma are like, well, I like Ijeoma, I like Amina, and more than that, they have a romantic relationship, so they're like, oh, it would be nice to be married to you. So yes, thanks so much for your thoughts on that, group 2. Let's move on to group 3, where we have violence in the police. Anybody who was in group 3? I know Sarah and Gilbert were in group 3. I don't necessarily want to hear from you. I want to hear from the others. Yes.
So we have talked about this quote, and I think it's more likely to referring to the topic of sexuality, because the two people who are beaten to death in this chapter is presenting the idea of homosexuality in it. And for the police, they have mentioned some quite offensive words towards the homosexual parties, which is let them roast like the focus they are. So we think that's the reasons here the police officers have that kinds of word is like they do not agree with all those homosexual person in this paragraph, and they, because it's linked to the church in the beginning of these chapters. So we think that they have the mindsets that have keeping the traditional relationship between like having a woman and a male instead of same sex. So that's why we think they have certain kinds of violence towards the peoples because due to their sexuality.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, it's definitely about their sexualities, and they use, I think what was really surprising is also the violent language that they use, and the fact that the author herself decides to use this language, which is quite telling. But I guess also she was trying to show really the violence, not only in physical terms, but also in the language that they use, also in the way that that people are treated in this society. And I think it is very interesting to think about violence against sexualities, against different forms of sexualities, and thinking about the police also as an arm of the state, right? So this links, I think, really quite well back to this whole idea that we've been talking about of maybe the colonial state and missionaries, because as you would know, same as the police in Hong Kong, for example, that was something that was specifically brought by the colonial administration. And so I think in a way, when I would imagine it, I imagine the police as an arm of the state in that way, as an arm of the colonial state. And so it's quite fitting for me for that they are very non-caring about the lives of these people who are expressing different forms of sexualities also. and also about just the idea of violence. I think that it is acceptable to a certain extent, that violence, so much so that somebody is killed, is happening in this society. And I think that this is something that many people have heard about, specifically the African continent as a whole, when we imagine it, when it comes to homosexual people. I think a lot of people have heard about homosexual people being killed and things like that, or people being stoned to death, for example. And this is the main narrative that comes up. And what I wanted to highlight with this is that it's very much a narrative that is present, right? So we don't want to erase this. We don't want to erase the realities of the people who are really being killed and dying for this reason. But also, I think what Okparanta does as a tribute to the communities who are actually fighting against this is showing that there's also another side. So not only are these people killed, but after that, there are people who carry these bodies and clean these bodies with care for them to be able to bury these bodies in a way that is also honorable for the people who have died. Right, great. And then we have the last one here. Oh, sorry. We have the last one here, which is the role of Christianity. So can we have group 4?
Hi. So can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I think the new confidence superior to the old confidence. So I think that God wants to write the law on people's hearts, and he wants to make people have a closer relationship with him, and to make people know him better, want to completely solve the problem of human sin. And I think all these grace are given by God himself. It is he who has prepared the salvation of man, human, and who has put the law in people's hearts and wants to be our God. And our responsibility is only to accept and believe. And all duties on the human side is trust, obedience, reliance are included. And since we are God humans, we should absolutely trust every arrangement he makes for us and obey everything that he arranged for us. So we think that the old confidence will fail because the confidence and man are two, and the new confidence is one, confidence and man. So it will never fail.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Thank you for that input. I think what you have highlighted is something that the author brings up time and time again, which in a sense she argues is this narrow reading of the Bible, in the sense that, and I guess a narrow reading of the Bible that plays out in the community, right? So that she sees, for example, also her mother doing, also, for example, the grammar school teacher and the society as a whole, she sees them as having a very narrow reading of the Bible. And in this narrow reading of the Bible, it says basically that, you know, you have to follow, you have to be obedient, you cannot challenge God and things like that. But what I find really quite interesting about Okparanta is she seems to take on the active role of an active believer who reacts back to her God, right? So if you see the second part of it, it says, it is this verse that fills my mind these days. This, it seems to me, is the lesson of the Bible, this affirmation of the importance of reflection and of revision, enough revision to sow ways with the tired, old, and even faulty laws, right? So I think that this was quite profound for me, even the first time that I read it, considering that I was born and raised Christian, right? And being born and raised Christian, you're often also given this idea that the Bible is the word of God, and so it cannot be wrong, right? But she points out that even there was an Old Testament and a New Testament, which says, and the reason the New Testament could exist was only because there was something wrong with the Old Testament. Because if the Old Testament had been so perfect as to say that it had been such a perfect iteration of God's word, then there wouldn't have been any need, right, for the New Testament. And this is her main argument, her main challenge, that says, you know, maybe at that time we had these certain laws, but it's time for us to challenge them. It is time for us, in essence, she is saying, to rewrite the Bible, right? Which is a very powerful statement to be making, especially in a country where you would have, you know, Christianity as one of the main religions and people very strongly believing in this religion, you know, and for you to say, in essence, as a human being, that I'm going to rewrite the word of God, I can just imagine, for example, in Zimbabwe, if somebody were to say that, people would be it would cause a lot of havoc, right? And I guess this is what surprised me most the first time that I read through this book, is this challenge, you know, not just of her society in a sense, but also specifically it's a challenge of the Bible, which is very interesting. But she doesn't just disregard the Bible. She doesn't just throw it away. She says, oh no, you know, it might have been relevant in a certain place and time, but it's not relevant anymore. And so we need to find a way to be able to negotiate new rules, which I think is really quite interesting. I wanted to ask if anybody else in any of the groups had something that they wanted to add. Maybe your group member, of course, did a good job, but maybe you felt like there was something that you still really wanted to discuss. If there is something like that, this is your chance to speak up on it. All right, so I'll assume that everybody has spoken their heart out. So I want to go to this last example that I had, which I also wanted to bring up in the discussion round, is specifically the mother-daughter relationship. So at the end of the book, as I said, Ijeoma goes back to her mother and she says, you know, I can't do this marriage anymore. I can't be married to this man anymore. I can't do it. And her mother says, all right, she said, all right, this was an understanding, discernment like tepid light, very understated, but an understanding nonetheless. And now she began muttering to herself, God, who created you, must have known what he did. Enough is enough. Who knows how long she'd been deliberating in this way. She cleared her throat and she finished. I'm not going to say that because I can't speak Igbo, but then let peace be, let life be, right? So I think it's an interesting note to end on there, because it kind of also addresses this hopeful nature that Okparanta brings into the novel, and also how she brings also a hopeful nature into the understanding of homosexuality within the prism of religion also, right? And so this is something that I think is her main message that she's trying to drive home, that in a lot of senses, and I think this is something that the Western world has also been doing in a very pronounced manner, is putting religion per se in opposition to anything that has to do with LGBTQ, right? So there is this idea of religion being some sort of a backward form of understanding life, a backward system of belief, whereas now if you're progressing, if you're a liberal, for example, and things like that, you are understood as being somebody who's LGBTQ friendly, but also somebody who does not endorse or adhere to any of the traditional religions, so to say. So I think it's really powerful in this way that she brings in, she breaks down this dichotomy that has been created. So I'm just seeing a message in the group, but I don't know in the chat, but I don't know if that's for now. That says, but now it is more like a nice thing to others' eyes than protective thing to one's own. I don't really know what that's referring to, but if you want to just speak on that, that's okay. Or if you just want to clarify it in the chat, then we can all know what you're speaking on. And yes, Rebecca, I know you had some parts of the book that you found really interesting and that you really also wanted to bring up and highlight in the conversation. So I want to give you a chance to be able to do that so we can have a bit of a discussion with that. And if anybody else also had something that you really found quite interesting or a passage you found you really wanted to discuss in the book, now we have the chance to kind of do a bit more of an open round discussion where we kind of bounce these ideas off each other.
So I guess I just wanted to speak a bit about the mother-daughter relationship as well. I found it interesting that during the first part of the book where she's trying to sort of, get rid of the daughter's homosexual feelings and sort of making her do all those Bible verses and things, I found myself, feeling quite negative towards the mother. But then towards the end, I was much more positive, especially when it got to that final passage, right? And I thought that idea of, the love of a parent for a child can kind of overcome any, you can rationalize any of the other things going on, right? Because she basically says, well, God must have known what he was doing. So she can rationalize it with the religion, with the society, with everything, because it's her child. And so I thought, you're right, that's a kind of hopeful ending, right? And the idea that that sort of parental or unconditional love can come through, and she can go against, her own religious beliefs, her own society, presumably her own experience, and just say, okay, I tried. I tried, but you know what? You're my daughter and you're going to do it the way you want to do it. And okay, fine. It's like, that's a very sort of parental view, right? It's like you try and you try and you try. And at the end of the day, you just go, you know what? As long as you're happy. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's really quite interesting, because when we think about, if we think about in a lot of societies, so even amongst the Igbo, there is a lot of this idea that the child does not only belong to this one parent, right, but to the community of the parents. And so for me, it was also quite hopeful in that if this one parent can get over that hurdle, maybe the other parents can also get over that hurdle in the same manner.
It reminded me of some of the things we've seen in terms of like sort of racist narratives as well. Like the idea, this happens a lot. It used to happen a lot in the UK, right? Where people would say, oh, well, I'm not racist. I just don't know anybody of a different race. And then of course, when they did know them, they'd be like, oh, well, they're fine. They're just like us. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like, I think that personal connection is maybe the hopeful note, right? Like if one person can accept one other person for their differences, then perhaps, like she talked about in the video where she said change can come from the bottom up, right? That maybe it's just an individual choice, that if the mother can accept the daughter, just as a person can accept, a neighbor of a different race, then maybe that is where the change comes,
For sure. And I think ever since this book has been written, so I think she was talking about how a lot of artists are taking up this space and wanting also to start these discussions and conversations. And I think what you see that's quite interesting is, I guess if you would be active on platforms, even things like Instagram, for example, is that you do see these people starting to have more of a personal connection with other people, and people being aware enough and proud enough to be able to speak out against these things, right? And that's not to say you're not going to face hate or things like that, but that there are people who are speaking out against it. And I guess the internet that also provides us with this platform to connect in that way, and that gives it a bit of a hopeful light, right? And But still, even if we look into the literary scene, for example, you will still see that some of the people still hold very homophobic ideas, even in the literature scene, which can be also very damaging. I know that there's a lot of wars between different authors that happen also because of these issues, right? And so it's not something that's existing in isolation, but it's definitely a hopeful way and a hopeful manner to be ending the book. And I guess for me, that's also the beauty of literature, is being able to imagine a different world, right? So in this way, you might argue that this book is a bit too optimistic, right? But it is something, it is a book that literature, in a sense, it gives you the space to imagine different worlds that maybe you're not seeing in your day-to-day life as you're seeing them today.
Yeah, and the other thing that stuck with me, I was just saying to you when they were in the breakout rooms, is because I picked this as part of our sort of like, we're doing 2 weeks on adolescence and sexuality, and I wanted to focus specifically on the adolescent side, because I thought that, you know, there's a sense in which that is the period of time in which you become aware of sexualities, you become aware of what is around you. And just like you had that quote of the conversation with Amina, right? You don't fully understand, but you kind of start to become aware of it. And so one of the quotes I really liked, it's from part 6 when they're in Port Harcourt. And it says something like, the gender of your first love determines the gender of all your future loves. And I just kind of really like that idea that adolescence is the period which shapes you in such a profound way that, you know, the person or persons whom you fall in love with, even at that age, even at like 13, 14, even though you don't really understand the full range of emotions yet, that has some sort of effect on your future.
Yeah.
And, you know, I thought that was an interesting idea, just that's really like the pivotal point, you know, or the point at which things start to become important to you in that way.
Yes, and I think it's really important, because a lot of times when we also speak about adolescent love, for example, it's often disregarded as something that's serious, you know, or you were just young, you were just infatuated, or things like that. And I think it is really important to give back this power and think about what impact does this really have on our lives, you know, reflect really on what that means. To be able to explore those things or not to explore those things at that age. And I think that's really quite powerful also.
Because the relationship with Amina, she doesn't obviously end up with Amina, but the relationship with Amina sets certain expectations for her going forward. And I think, you know, no matter whether we're talking about heterosexual or homosexual love, that period of adolescence is really the time where we start to think about, like, you know, what makes me love this person? What makes me attracted to this person? How does my desire work? And it's that sort of kind of exploratory time, you know, not to say that people don't change after adolescence, but I think there's something in that first relationship where you first understand what's going on a bit.
Yes, for sure.
And I think the other incident I wanted to talk about, which was kind of a bit more lighthearted, was the way that they found sanctuary in the church. So there was the point where she gets taken to, I think it's Ndidi's church, isn't it? And basically the church functions as a sanctuary for these women to go, and they dance and they chat and they kiss and they sort of meet and each other. And I just really loved the way that they were all kind of hiding in plain sight, right? That they're in a church, and so it looks like, well, you know, nobody could object if you say I'm going to church, right? And yet what it was a safe space for them. So I think, like, as much as religion is sometimes responsible for negative outcomes, I think the idea of having a church as a sanctuary is also a possibility. It doesn't have to be linked to negative outcomes necessarily. And that was kind of interesting, because that was a way that they could get around the rules of society but without compromising themselves completely. Like, I know, I mean, I think it's burnt down, isn't it, in the end? I mean, it doesn't end well, but the idea of having a space which is acceptable to your society, but which also allows you to be yourself, I think is an interesting way to kind of resist.
And I think using the church in that way was also a smart move by Operanta's side, because what I think she's constantly trying to drive home is this idea of the church, though Christianity, in her understanding of it, is not something that is against homosexuality.
Right, right.
And specifically what she's highlighting is it's about your reading of this text, right? And so I guess also in that way, like a lot of people, you would read a text, profound text, for example, like the Quran or the Bible, in this way that they have survived this long. And a lot of people read very different things out of these texts. And that's what she's kind of trying to highlight more and more, that in her understanding of it, it's not maybe necessarily something that is so opposed and so much at polar opposites. And I think that's very powerful also to bring. One last thing I just wanted to touch on, which I think we didn't really touch on, was this idea of the fact that there's a war happening in the background. And I think that it's very interesting when you see the effects of the war on each of their lives, right? So firstly, you have Uzo, the father, who kind of has this breakdown just before he dies, and that seems in a sense to lead to his death. You have Adaora, the mother, who goes into like this very depressive state and a state of almost like a trance state when her husband dies. You also have Amina, who loses her whole family, and she also has really pronounced fears through that, and she also has the sense of loss because she has lost her family. And there's one time when she even has a fight with Ijeoma, because Ijeoma has seemed to suggest that at least, you know, the war brought us together, you know, and she says, well, you know, you wanted my parents to die for this, and like my family and things like that. And I think what's quite interesting when we think about it, also bringing the book back into the context of talking about the African context in general, is that in a lot of times war is something that is seen to be almost acceptable when it comes to the context of Black and brown bodies across the world. So I think this is something that we saw, especially with Ukraine, when we saw so many of these racist comments being made about how these are white people, these are people who are similar to us and things like that. So war being less acceptable when it's being exercised on white bodies than when it is being exercised on Black and brown bodies. But I think what Operanta is doing with this is showing again just the humanity of her characters and how they are very much touched and affected by the effects of the war and how they suffer in the same way. So you don't have this image of, you know, she could have, for example, had Adaora, who is Ijeoma's mother, just being this strong Black woman, and the stereotype. She could have done that to her. She could have just had her moving on and living on her life and pretending as if nothing had happened, but she chose to not take on that narrative, and she chose to show her also as a person with weaknesses. And I think that's quite powerful also when we're thinking about the context of war, especially now when the context of Ukraine is so present in so many people's minds, but we're not thinking in the same way about different wars that are happening on the earth and why that is the case. Yes.
And also, yeah, I mean, also the idea that I was struck by how vulnerable Amina was, right? Because having lost her family in the same way as when they lose their father, right? So the idea of the women being especially vulnerable to losing the men as a result of a war, you think is quite powerful. Like that whole idea of being displaced and losing your family, like what is Amina supposed to do? You know, she's basically just kind of gets pushed around from here to there. She has very little agency. I mean, that's quite, you know, that's something that stays with you, right? No matter what the war is.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah. Great. I think I've touched on most of the points that I want to touch on. Once again, I want to give you a chance. If you have any questions or any statements, it doesn't need to be a question, comments that you want to say. I think Rebecca and I have had quite a discussion now too.
We could do this all day, couldn't we, Marika? We could do this all day.
At the book club. So if anybody else has any more statements or questions or comments that you want to say, I will give you a minute to think about it, and then we can round up. All right. I am satisfied that you don't have anything lingering in your mind. So if you do come up with some questions, you can also let me know. I think what I want to leave you with is that if we think about, so this book was written in 2015. If we think about the LGBTQ community in Nigeria today, you will see that it seems to be quite a growing community, and in a sense that there's a lot of different organizations that are coming up in that way, and that are kind of trying to build and form around this idea. I will give you a name that maybe you can look up on Instagram, because he basically is very active in this community in Nigeria, and I'm sure if you were to look him up, you can find all of the links to everything else and all the other organizations. And yes, that would kind of bring us to the end of this session. Thank you so much for participating and for being so active, especially in the breakout rooms and the discussions that you were having there. And it was lovely to meet you all, and maybe someday we'll be able to meet also at the Africa Center. Thank you, Rebecca, for having me.
Oh, thank you, Marika. And I'd also like to thank our administrative assistant, Eunice, and Dr. Michelle Chan and Dr. Jenny Wan for helping me promote it on social media. And Gilbert, thank you for coming. Sarah, thank you for coming. And Marika, I hope we can do this again soon. It was really wonderful. I'm sure the students were very grateful to hear a different voice. It was not just me. And it was a lot of fun. So thank you so much for coming. If you don't mind, I'm going to stay on the Zoom call with the students because I just want to prime them for the reading next week. And I know there are some groups presenting next week. So perhaps Marika, Sarah, and Gilbert, you're welcome to leave. And if the group of students from 460 could stay on, and I'll just talk to you a bit about next week, okay? So thank you again. It was wonderful. Thanks very much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye. So hi, students. I'm sorry, just to wrap up very quickly. I wanted to remind you of two things. The first is that next week we'll be doing the second part of our section on adolescence and sexuality. We are looking at the novel Normal People by Sally Rooney, and very differently set, but also dealing with an adolescent couple, this time a heterosexual couple, in Ireland in the present day. So this is also dealing with the idea of young love, adolescence, and sexuality, but from a sort of slightly different location and a slightly different cast of characters. If you haven't had a chance to read the book, or you're not able to finish the book or get hold of the book, there is a TV series made of this novel. It's quite a recent TV series. I'm not entirely sure where it's available, but I'm sure you'll be able to track it down. I don't think it's on Netflix, but it might be on other platforms. Perhaps you can track it down. I believe it's about 10 or 12 episodes, but even if you just watched the first couple of episodes when the main characters are in high school, that would give you some sense of their relationship and some of the issues that we're going to be talking about next week. The other thing is, I know there are some presenters next week. If any of the presenters have questions, I'm happy to take questions in the next 5 minutes or so. If you don't have questions or you're not presenting next week, there's no homework for next week. You are welcome to leave the meet now. If you do have questions about the presentation, I'm happy to answer those as well. So it's up to you. If you're not presenting, you don't have questions, you feel free to leave the meet. And thank you for joining in today. If you are presenting and you have questions, I'm happy to answer them.